All right, guys. Well, welcome to the TBL day number 4. We're going to talk about the shoulder and brachium muscles. So let's get right into it. Again, we're looking at the shoulder girdle here. So the shoulder girdle includes the clavicle, right, the humerus, scapula, okay, and then we also kind of have the sternum involved in the SC joint there, okay, and then we have the glenohumeral joint, which is right here. All right, we got the sternoclavicular joint, that SC joint right there, acromioclavicular joint right there, and we kind of have this articulation between the scapula and the thorax, the scapulothoracic articulation. Okay, that's kind of just a look at the shoulder. So let's dive into some of the muscles. Okay, so if we look at the muscles of the shoulder girdle, you guys looked at these this week in lab in the cat. Some of them are most of them are the same. There's a couple that are slightly different. Okay. So notice we see both superficial and deep muscles, both anteriorly and posteriorly. Okay, so on the anterior side, these are the superficial muscles. This side would be the deep. Okay, deep, superficial, and then on the posterior side, superficial, deep over here. Okay, because there's some muscles removed on the right side of each. Okay, so which nerve innervates most of these? We're just going to call it the brachial plexus, which is not really a nerve. It's a big bundle of nerves, but we'll leave it at that. Okay, so muscle number 1 there. If you clearly know that one's pectoralis major. 2, if we pull that back, pull that number 1 back, we get pectoralis minor. 3, the one we saw in the cat, it was called serratus ventralis, but here in the humans, serratus anterior. Okay, and then we go to the posterior side. Number 4, big muscle that was 3 muscles in the cat, in the human it's 1, the trapezius muscle. Again, we kind of have the upper, middle, and lower trapezius, and those can be activated separately. Okay, number 5, if we pull the trapezius muscle off, we can see the rhomboids. Saw those in the cat as well. Number 6 is that big latissimus dorsi muscle, and finally 7 is a deeper muscle underneath there that's a scapular mover called Levator Scapulae. Remember, there's no ventralis in the name of the humans. Okay, so there's a little overview. Let's talk about the scapular movements. These are a little bit tricky. And so really what we have here is we have some simple ones. Be elevation. This would be like shrugging your shoulders. Okay. Depression, which would be like pushing those shoulder blades down. Adduction, probably more commonly known as retraction, is when you squeeze your shoulder blades together. Right. So those are pushing together. Okay. We have abduction or protraction. It's the opposite. That would be kind of bringing your shoulder blades forward around your back. And then we have the 2 rotational ones, which are a little bit tricky. So upward rotation has to occur when we abduct our shoulders, okay? So we'll put with abduction. Okay, downward rotation occurs with adduction. Okay, so when you lift your shoulder up into abduction, after you get above 90 degrees, those scapula have to rotate up to do that, and then on the way back down, they rotate down. Okay, so this one here, called upward rotation, right? Sorry, that slide's a little bit messed up. That one down there would be called downward rotation. Okay, so let's start with some muscles. So the latissimus dorsi has just a massively wide origin, all the way from T7 all the way down to L5. Okay, so way down here. Okay, so very broad origin, and then all of those muscles coming from all those different angles comes up, and they wrap around the anterior side of the humerus right here, right? And then they have one single pretty small insertion point, and you see that since it wraps around the shoulder this way, that's going to make it an internal rotator. We'll talk about that on the next slide. But it's also our major shoulder extensor, one of our strongest shoulder extensors for sure, because of its size and how it pulls back. So major shoulder extensor, definitely an adductor as well, definitely pulls down, depresses the scapula, and it causes that internal rotation. Okay, so activities that do this, we're thinking of things that we're doing like lat pull downs. If doing this same motion, doing the same motion here that this guy is, instead if he looks like he's doing more of a pull-up, instead the bar would be coming down. Okay, pull-ups do it as well, but typically we think of more of like pull down like activities like that. Okay, so Levator Scapulae is another one. We can see it clearly here. Attaches to that superior medial angle of the scapula. Okay, It's an elevator. It elevates or levates the scapula, right? And then it's also a downward rotator. We'll talk about that a little bit more in class as to why it is, but just remember that for now, that it's a downward rotator, meaning that it causes this motion. And that's partially because of where it pulls. Since it pulls right here, it kind of creates this axis of movement around this way instead of the opposite way. Okay? It's also, if the shoulder is fixed, it also acts on the neck. So it causes side flexion of the neck to the same side if the shoulder doesn't, the scapula is not moving. Okay, rhomboid muscles. We see them here. Oops. Sorry. Why is that not working? Sorry guys, hold on one sec. We'll get back there. Okay, so rhomboids. So we see them here. These are our primary scapular retractor, pinching those shoulder blades together. They're also downward rotators of the scapula. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about why, but again, if they're pulling this way and attaching way down here, their angle of pull for the rotational part is going to be that way. All right, so those are going to be pulling that way, which is downward rotation of the scapula. Okay, working out these muscles, contracting them, having strong rhomboids is important for pulling your shoulder blades back and avoiding what's called kyphosis, which means you're kind of slumped forward with your shoulder blades protracted and your head down forward. That strengthening those rhomboids can pull you back into the correct posture. This is a rhomboid shape. That's why I have that there. That's why they're called that, because they're the shape of a rhomboid. Okay, trapezius muscles, another large muscle. These have a massive origin, all the way from C7, right, all the way down to T12, as far as the spinous processes, but then even all the way up at the occipital bone, right? So occipital bone way the heck up there, so pretty much our whole spine, except for the lumbar spine, is the origin, and then it inserts, the upper part inserts on the acromion. All the other ones, we get a lot on the spine of the scapula in the mid-range, and then the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle. Okay, so this one is shaped like a trapezius. That's why it's called that. So trapezius, the actions, upper fibers elevate and upwardly rotate. Middle fibers are straight in the middle, so they just retract, they pull it back, and those lower fibers pull it down, they depress. Again, if the shoulder is fixed, the upper fibers will extend the neck, so pull it back, and then cause side flexion to the same side. So that would be like taking your right ear over to your right shoulder. Okay, very common place for trigger points, right? As well as just knots in your neck. Those knots you always get when you're stressed out. Very common in the upper trapezius. So I'll let you take some time to summarize those posterior muscles by origin, insertion, and action. Okay, so look at the anterior muscles now. Pectoralis major is a big one on the anterior side, much bigger than the minor in humans, but the opposite in cats. Okay, originates partially on the clavicle, partially on the sternum, and then all the way down here in the cartilage of the rib. So very broad origin, and then that all comes together with a pretty pinpoint insertion on the anterior side of the humerus. Okay, it's a shoulder flexor, causes shoulder flexion. Its primary role is, we would think of as shoulder adduction. It does cause some internal rotation because as it pulls this way, it rotates the shoulder in. Okay, so the exercises that are important for this, we're thinking of bench press, right, push-ups, anything where we do a lot of shoulder flexion as well as shoulder adduction. Okay, flies. Okay. All right, pectoralis minor. If we take pectoralis major off there, we can see pectoralis minor underneath. So you can see very different angle of pull, right? So pulling straight up like this, and then that really pulls down when it pulls on the scapula, okay? So it comes off the ribs, goes to the coracoid process of the scapula, okay? So this one's a downward rotator, all right, as well as the other ones, okay? So we'll talk a little bit more about that in class and show how that works, but it's because of the way that it pulls on it, the angle becomes a downward rotator. You have to kind of think about it. I'll show it in a sec and also in class, okay? So think about it, it's pulling this way on the scapula, And and so then the other way to think about it is if the scapula is fixed, it actually helps us lift up the rib cage, so it becomes a breathing muscle in some cases. Okay, and again, we'll get back to that pectoralis major, and I'll explain more about how it downwardly rotates in class. All right, serratus anterior, it means saw or serrated. Its origin is on the anterior ribs here, okay, as well as the lateral, and then it inserts on the anterior part of the medial scapula. Okay, so way up in there on the scapula. Okay, its main job is to pull the scapula against the thorax. Okay, it also protracts the scapula, so brings it forward. Okay, so when you think of something like a punching motion, punching straight forward, or think of an offensive lineman in football, taking both of their arms and slamming the guy in front of them and pushing forward, that would be an important one for serratus anterior. Okay, so we kind of think of these as punching. Okay, this idea of winging of the scapula, what happens here is when the serratus anterior isn't contracting, a lot of times it's because the nerve, you have nerve damage for the nerve that innervates the serratus anterior. A lot of times there is nerve damage to that, and what happens is the scapula actually pops up off of the back, and you can see it lift up instead of staying nicely down on the rib cage. The serratus anterior doesn't contract. That allows the scapula to pop up, and that's called winging of the scapula. Okay, so opportunity here to summarize the muscles again, put them in your own way to summarize, and also in this way. Okay, so pectoralis major, actions on the shoulder. So we talked about this in lab a little bit. So is it a flexor or an extensor? We said there that it was a flexor. It's definitely an adductor. Okay, it is not an abductor. Okay, and then it's definitely an internal rotator, not an external rotator because of its anterior insertion. Okay, but then the part about flexion extension, it actually does both flexion extension. Depends on where you start. So if you start with your shoulder already in flexion, so meaning your hand up, kind of like you're raising your hand, think about the direction of pull of those pecs. They're pulling down on the pecs. That would be causing extension. If you start with your hand all the way back, your shoulder all the way back in extension, think about the angle of pull of those pecs. They're still pulling into flexion. Okay? So we'll talk more about that in class as well. Okay, so let's look at some of those scapular movements and kind of put this together. So if we're looking at scapular elevation, again, that's kind of a shrug. Which muscles do this? Definitely our upper traps are helping with that. Levator Scapulae is helping with that. Okay, when would we actually do that? Well, we do it with a shoulder activity, like a shoulder shrug. We also do this when we're just carrying something. We're holding a suitcase, right? Holding a bag, holding it down at our side, but with our arm. We have to be using those scapular elevation muscles just to hold our scapula in place, or else it would sag down, right? So that's an important use of that. The other side of things, the depression side, we're thinking about the muscles that are pulling the scapula down. So lower traps, serratus anterior is important for stabilizing the scapula. Pectoralis major and latissimus dorsi kind of act together to pull down on the humerus, really, but that also pulls down the scapula in the process. So think of something like this, like lifting up from a chair, right? Or we can think of another thing would be walking on crutches, right? We're pushing down as we walk. Okay, let's look at the rotators a little bit. So when we think about upward rotation of the scapula, so this would be a posterior view, right? This would be a left scapula. Is that right? Yeah, so posterior view, left scapula. And so what we've got here is we've got, oh, sorry, that is not a left scapula, that's a right scapula. My bad, that's a right scapula because this is serratus anterior, which is going to be more lateral. All right, this is the acromion process out here, coracoid process. Okay, sorry, I needed to get my orientation there. So this is posterior view looking at a right scapula. Okay, so the upward rotators, we're talking about this movement here. We think of upper trapezius, it's right here, right? Look at that angle of pull. It's pulling this direction, okay? That direction, okay? We think of lower trapezius doing this too, right? So lower trapezius is coming this way, pulling straight down, okay? And then we think of serratus anterior, as that one is pulling this direction. Okay, so you think about that. Again, trapezius, upper trapezius that way, lower trapezius that way, serratus anterior that way. You can see how this creates this overall rotational movement in that way. But they really all work together for doing this. So we have to do this every time we abduct our shoulder above 90 degrees. Okay. So this shows you a little bit clearly that same idea. Again, the upper traps working together with the lower traps and the serratus anterior to create this rotational movement. Okay, see the same thing here with these other motions. This one includes a couple other muscles that I didn't include before, but don't worry about those extra muscles that I didn't mention before. This one has upper traps, lower traps, and serratus anterior. Okay, what about downward rotation? So the other way. So we're thinking Levator Scapulae, Rhomboids, and Pectoralis Minor. Those were the three that I said were previously were downward rotators. Okay, so we think of our rhomboids. They have this angle where they attach way inferior on the scapula, so they're pulling up this way. Levator Scapulae is pulling up this way, and then Pectoralis Minor. This is the one that's a little bit trickier, right? We're talking about it coming off the coracoid process, coming this way. All right, so these ones are pulling this way, this one's pulling this way. You can see where we get this overall downward rotation. So think of this as swimming, right? We're pulling back, pulling down, using the hoe in the garden, right? We reach out and then pull backwards. Okay, rowing, rock climbing, all of these things need downward rotation in a forceful fashion. Okay, what about protraction? Protraction is when that shoulder blade comes forward. So in Albert Pujols here, when he's swinging, since he's a right-handed batter, his right scapula is protracting, even though his left scapula is retracting. Okay, golfing, same thing. This golfer here, the left scapula is protracting here. The right one is retracting. So we're thinking Pectoralis Minor, serratus anterior are important for that. And there's some movements where you need to do that. Okay, retraction the other way could be just the other two arms on the baseball player and the golfer. But I also think of scapular retraction here in the backhand in tennis, right? This scapula is retracting as he's doing that. So we're thinking of our rhomboids and then both our middle and upper trapezius doing that. So we can think of the tennis backhand, rowing, swimming, army crawl. Anytime you're grabbing onto something and pulling it, that would require retraction. Okay, so let's switch gears from the from the scapular muscles and move into the shoulder muscles, the ones that are attached to the humerus. Okay, so we look at these different muscles here. We want to look at which one is each. Okay, so let's start with the anterior view. Right, this is anterior, and this is posterior. Okay, all right. So working on the anterior side, the only anterior rotator cuff muscle, subscapularis. All right. Okay, and then we go to the posterior side, we can see supraspinatus, it's above the spine of the scapula. Infraspinatus is below it, okay? And then we can see D there, the Teres Minor, which is a posterior muscle, comes right below infraspinatus. We can see a little bit of it sticking down from the anterior side as well. Okay? Oops, and then E, we go to the deltoid muscles. That's going to be our primary shoulder mover. And then again, we're talking brachial plexus, for which nerve innervates all of these. Okay, so let's start with the deltoid muscles. Triangle shape, that's why it's called deltoid. Okay, they come off the clavicle as well as the acromion, the spine, and the scapula, and they all insert in the same spot, deltoid tuberosity. Okay, so actions, it does all three main motions of the shoulder, which is flexion, abduction, and extension. So this is going to be the anterior part, this is going to be the lateral part, this is going to be the posterior part of the deltoids. Okay, injections, this is a common place for injections because there's a lot of muscle. So very common to get your flu shot there, other vaccines there, because it just goes right into the muscle. Okay, so rotator cuff muscles. Let's look at them from a different angle here. We look at, this is a good way to remember them. This is SITS acronym, supraspinatus, so supra, infra, teres minor, and then on the anterior side, subscapularis. Okay, So their main role is to stabilize the shoulder, because what they do, you can see this view over here is a lateral view. You can see their insertion points, right? So Teres Minor, Infraspinatus, Supraspinatus, and Subscapularis. They create a cuff around the humeral head, and they all pull at the same time and pull that humeral head into the glenoid. Okay, they're also important for deceleration. When we go to throw and we need to slow down our arm, these muscles contract to slow us down. And they're also rotators, so internal, external, abduction, depending on which one. And we'll talk about which one here. So which one's an internal rotator? I'll let you guys figure that one out on your own. Okay, so let's look at each one. Supraspinatus, okay? It's primarily an abductor, stabilizes the shoulder. Oftentimes, it's the one that's problematic in impingement syndrome because it's inserts right on the very top of the humeral head, and that's the part that's most commonly going to get pinched in there. Okay, infraspinatus inserts a little bit lower than supraspinatus, and so instead of being just a total abductor like supraspinatus is, infraspinatus comes around, kind of wraps around a little bit, so that makes it an external rotator as well as a stabilizer. Teres Minor also comes and wraps around the back, so again that's an external rotator as well as a stabilizer. Okay, and then Subscapularis. Now we're on the anterior view here, right? This is the anterior view, so that comes around, wraps around the anterior side of the scapula, so that one is the internal rotator, right? Because it's going to pull the humerus that direction. Okay, those are the rotator cuff muscles and the deltoids. Okay, so let's look at some of those shoulder motions. So again, if we're starting in an already extended position, not like Mike Tyson is here, he's in a flex position with his left one, but his right one is in an extended position. If we're starting an already extended position, that's where we activate pectoralis major to help us with flexion. Okay, but it's only going to help us with flexion until we get to anatomical position, and then we go into more flexion like he is here. Then the pecs won't help anymore, but then we're relying mostly on the anterior fibers of the deltoid. Okay, but what if we start right in anatomical position and then just go up into flexion? Then we're only using the deltoid. So if you want to really swing, do a hard uppercut like this, all right, then you start back, you rear back further, and then swing forward so you can get the activity of the pecs as well as the deltoid. Okay, shoulder extension. Again, we have this thing with the pectoralis major helping us if we start in a flex position. Okay, so if we start already up in that uppercut position and then we pull back into extension, like she would be doing here during the spike, then the pecs are going to help us with that. Okay, they're going to help us right till we get down to anatomical position, and then we're going to be relying mostly on the posterior deltoid, but then we've also got the lats to help us with this. We don't have a big muscle like that on the anterior side that's going to help us with this all the time, but the lats are very strong shoulder extensor along with the posterior deltoids. So we're thinking of volleyball, spike, right? We're thinking swimming, other activities like that. Shoulder abduction, abduction, okay? So if we're starting in anatomical position, from 0 to 90, which is just straight abduction straight to the side, we get a little bit of help from supraspinatus. We're doing mostly middle fibers of the deltoid, okay, or lateral deltoid. Once we get above 90 degrees, okay, we use those same ones. We use the deltoids, but now we have to move, well, with these two at least, now we have to move the scapula, right? And which way we got to do it? We got to do upward rotation of the scapula. And then the rotator cuff muscles are important for holding that humeral head in place once that scapula starts moving. Shoulder adduction, two big ones, pec major, latissimus dorsi. This would be an example of a strong adduction motion, as well as swimming. Michael Phelps here. All right. Okay, so a little bit of recap. I'll let you fill that in, kind of grapple with that a little bit on your own. Okay, and now lastly, let's look at the brachium muscles. I know this is a lot of muscles coming at you. So this is the brachium muscles. Now we're talking about the upper arm muscles, right? So upper arm muscles, this first set here is going to be our triceps, but that's specifically our lateral head, number one is. Number two is our long head, and three is the medial head of the triceps. Okay, so triceps because it's got three muscles, right? So that's the posterior view. Again, this is anterior. All right, so then, yeah, same thing over here. Okay, but then if we look at number 4, that's an anterior muscle. That's the long head of the biceps there. Number 5, short head of the biceps there. Okay, number 6, we find that underneath, and that's actually a large muscle, bigger muscle than the biceps, called the brachialis. Okay, and then lastly, number 7 is also an elbow flexor, but it's really more found in the forearm. That's the brachial radialis. Okay, let's look at those. And here's a good question for you. Which elbow flexor is the strongest? I did just kind of allude to this, but this is typically the brachialis is stronger than this one or either head of the biceps brachii. Or if we even put these two together, that would still be weaker, typically, than the brachialis. It's a bigger muscle. Okay, triceps brachii. Again, it's got 3 heads. Innervation is the radial nerve here. Okay, originates differently depending on which head you're talking about. The one thing I want you to note here is this one's on the scapula. This one's humerus. So it's a long head because it actually crosses the shoulder, right? Whereas the other ones don't. The other ones are just elbow muscles. Okay, they all insert together on the olecranon fossa. So they're elbow extensors, right? That's our main elbow extensor. But the long head also acts as shoulder extension. So if you want to stretch out the triceps the best, you got to put your elbow into flexion, but then you put your shoulder also into flexion to stretch out that long head. That's why you do the triceps stretch that way. Okay, so there it is. We can see the triceps lateral head coming off the humerus, medial head coming off the humerus, but then that long head is way up here off of the scapula. That makes it a scapular or mover as well, or a shoulder extensor as well as an elbow extensor. Okay, biceps brachii. There's 2 heads. They're called biceps. This nerve is called the musculocutaneous nerve. So the short head goes right to the coracoid process right there. Long head goes up over the humerus into the scapula, and it's the upper rim of the glenoid fossa, really partially on the labrum too, that cartilage. And they all insert on the radial tuberosity, right there, right? So on the radius, okay? That's going to be important for them being a supinator, okay? So when we supinate the arm, right? Or the forearm, we put our palm up, right? The biceps are important for helping us do that because of their insertion on the radius. And then primarily the biceps are elbow flexors. All right, brachialis muscle, you can see comes from about the midpoint of the humerus, crosses the elbow, attaches to the ulna, and it's a strong elbow flexor. Okay, brachial radialis, innervated by the radial nerve. Okay, its origin is on the distal humerus, so way down here at the bottom of the humerus, but then look at the insertion, goes way down here, almost crosses the wrist, but it doesn't cross the wrist, goes all the way to the styloid process of the radius. So it's an elbow flexor, but kind of a strange one because it goes way down there, almost to the wrist. Okay, so that we can run through this together. So which triceps head crosses 2 joints? Actually, I'll let you do that because you can go back to the notes and that'll help you learn it more than me just telling you the answers. Which biceps head is also important for shoulder, an important shoulder stabilizer. We talked about that one before, but think about the one that goes up and over the humeral head and attaches to the glenoid. The glenoid labrum. And then this one we haven't talked about yet, but how to target each elbow flexor. Okay, so when you think about your hand being up, if you want to do curls, like in the gym, you grab a dumbbell and you do curls, okay, most of the time your palm is facing directly up, right? And that one is going to be, so if we're in full supination, that's going to be biceps, because we just saw that the biceps are supinators, so that will activate the biceps the best. Brachialis will be the complete opposite, all the way over in pronation, because we kind of take the biceps out of it a little bit there by going all the way into pronation, so that's holding your palm down and doing curls. But then the one where you put your thumb up in the middle, thumb up, those are kind of known as hammer curls. And I'll show you this in class as well. That one's going to be brachioradialis. Okay, which one's the strongest? We talked about that. You can go back and check that out. Which elbow flexor is also a supinator. We just talked about that as well. I'll let you fill that in. All right, so a couple things with elbow flexion. If we start all the way supinated like we are here, okay, then we're going to use mostly biceps brachii, but also brachialis. If we start in pronation, you don't see biceps brachii here, right? You see brachialis, brachioradialis. Pronator teres helps a little bit, but not much. But you can see by going into pronation with your palm down, you lose the help of biceps brachii. So which starting position is stronger? Supination is, because biceps brachii helping is much more important than brachioradialis, because biceps brachii is a bigger muscle. So that supination curl is a much stronger curl. Okay, so other elbow movements. Elbow extension is pretty simple because that's just triceps, pronation, pronator teres, supination, biceps brachii. Okay, and so you can kind of think of some things that you need to do with each movement. All right. Okay, guys, that was a quick run through. Spend a lot of time studying that, and we'll see you on Monday for the TBL day.